Welcome back to Fossil Ridge Games. Today I'm going to teach you the board game Clank. This is going to be a basic video on how to play the game and also some basic strategies. The first part of this video is intended for new players. I'm going to walk you through all of the game mechanics and the basic rules of the game. Later on, toward the end of the video, at 45:33 is where the strategy section picks up. So if you know how to play the game, feel free to skip to 45:33. What exactly is Clank? Clank is a game where you play the role of a sneaky rogue who infiltrates a labyrinth under a castle to steal artifacts from a powerful dragon. The clank represents the noise that you're making as you traverse the dungeon. The more noise you make, the more likely that the dragon will attack you. This game mechanic is absolutely fantastic. It's very, very unique, at least from the games that I've played, and I find it really, really interesting. If you want to be bold and daring, you're going to acquire more clank over the course of the game, and thus more likely to be attacked by the dragon. However, if you play a more conservative role, a more sneaky role, you're going to acquire less clank. But then again, over the course of the game, you might acquire less victory points. The purpose of Clank is to get your adventurer down into the depths of this maze and catacomb and recover one of these artifacts, then take your adventurer and make it back to the top of the castle without dying. The person or the player with the highest victory point total will win the game. The portion of the board where the artifacts reside is known as the depths. You can see this green layer of grass, which will be important for certain characteristics and certain cards in the game. So all of your artifacts are going to exist in the depths, and they're going to range from a victory point total of 5 all the way up to 30 on the right-hand side of the board. Now, the point totals are going to vary based upon the difficulty of obtaining that artifact. So as you can see, the one that's worth 5 points and 7 points is located kind of in the middle of the board. It's just below the depths, but they're fairly easy to get. Whereas some of the ones that are more expensive, as in the 25 marker and the 30 marker, are extremely difficult to get and to get out of the dungeon alive. So there's kind of a risk versus reward system set up in this game. If you're willing to dive into the depths and you're willing to risk death, you can actually come out with bigger artifacts and thus a higher point total. So once you have an artifact, you want to take your piece and make it all the way back to the top of the castle. This is where you start the game. If you can do that, you will receive a 20-point mastery token. So the mastery token, I'll go ahead and zoom in. And you get this only if you escape the dungeon with one of these artifacts. If you can do that, you're going to score 20 points. 20 points in this game is a pretty hefty amount of points, so you definitely want to focus on escaping the dungeon before you actually die. Now, there's another sort of caveat to this, and I mentioned this before. If, for instance, you are able to get one of the artifacts and you get out of the depths, but let's say you die somewhere in here, what's going to happen is the villagers are going to pull you out of the catacomb and you're going to score whatever victory points you have. You don't get the mastery token unless you escape alive. Now, here's the unfortunate thing. If you die in the depths, you get 0 points for the game. So let's bring everything together. So what we do know is that anything that gives you victory points in this game is going to have this green octagon symbol on it with a number in the middle of it. What that means is that you get that many victory points at the end of the game. So you can get it obviously from the artifacts, what we've talked about, and then the mastery tokens. Something else you can get it from are certain cards in the game. So this is going to be a deck building game. I'm going to walk you through pretty soon on what that means. But note too that some of the cards in this game also have that symbol in the top right-hand corner. So for instance, this card, the Emerald, would be worth 5. Also, there are these question mark tokens that exist on the game board, and you can take them. In this case, we have a Dragon Egg, which is going to give you 3 victory points at the end of the game. And then this large question mark icon is a Chalice, and that's going to give you 7 at the end of the game as well. And then something else that we have are gold tokens, which are present in the game. So gold is kind of dual purpose in this game. One, you can use the gold to buy items from the marketplace in the depths of the dungeon. And then alternatively, if you don't spend your gold at the end of the game, you're going to get 1 victory point for every unspent gold that you have. So in this case, this 1 gold piece would be worth 1 victory point, then 5 victory points for the 5, and then 10 for the 10 gold piece. Now I'm going to walk you through the basics of a deck building game. Deck building games have the player start with a general set of cards. In Clank, the basic decks will contain 10 cards. You have 1 copy of Scramble, 1 copy of Sidestep, 2 copies of Stumble, and then 6 copies of this Burgle card. Now, what makes this game kind of fun, and any deck building game, is that you start with a very basic deck. And over the course of the game, you have the opportunity to purchase additional cards and to augment your deck. As an example, we can purchase this card right here, which is the Explore card, and add it to the deck. So as we start with 10 cards, as we start adding additional ones into it, our deck will grow from 10 cards to 11 to 12 and 13 and 14 and so on and so forth over the course of the game. And what's interesting about that is that the rarity, or rather how often you draw certain cards, will be changed as you start adding more and more into this deck. So think of it as the probability is changing over the course of the game as you make this deck larger and larger and larger. What else makes a deck building game so exciting is that you get to pick the strategy on what goes into your draw deck. So purchase cards that you're interested in over the course of the game, or purchase cards that are directly in relation to the strategy that you're trying to do. And what makes this fun is that each game is different. So you can respond to different changes in the board environment and different changes in what's available for purchase, and you can really customize your draw deck for that game. Now that we know the basics of deck building, I'm going to kind of walk you through what that means. So I'm going to take all of these cards from the basic sort of draw deck, and I'm just going to shuffle and mix them around. So in Clank, you're going to have a draw deck, and each turn you're going to draw 5 cards. So as an example, I would draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and for that turn, this would be the hand of cards that I could play for that turn. So each and every turn is going to be slightly different, and as you add more cards into your draw deck, it's going to change what you're drawing out of that deck, and those 5 cards are going to be shifted around almost every turn that you play this game. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the basics on what these different symbols mean. So I'm going to go to the Burgle card, and I'm going to point to this 1 that is in the blue diamond at the top of the card. That is known as a skill point, and I want you to think of that as purchasing power for additional cards to go into your draw deck. So as an example, I have 4 of these skill icons present in my hand, and I can play these cards in any order. So basically what I would do is I'd have my hand of cards, I'd play down a Burgle card, I might play down a second one, a third one, and then finally this Scramble card. That would give me 4 skill points. Now I'll walk you through how you purchase cards from the dungeon row. Now we're going to talk about the dungeon row. In this game, there are going to be 6 cards from the draw deck turned face up. And these are cards that you can interact with while you are going through the dungeon. So first and foremost, we're going to have these 5 cards. And what I'm going to do is zoom in on the corner of the archaeologist. And please note that there is a 2 blue icon at the bottom right-hand corner of this card. What that means is that I would need 2 skill points worth of cards. So as an example, I've got my 2 Burgle cards. So I have 1, 2 skill points. So thus I would need 2 points to purchase the archaeologist. If I did purchase the archaeologist, I would take this and put it face up in my discard pile. Something else that we have in this game is a generic set of cards, which are typically placed pretty close to the dungeon row. And these represent generic cards, and these are kind of a good way to get your deck moving at the beginning of the game. I'm going to zoom in and focus on the Mercenary card and the Explore card. So if you look at the bottom of the Mercenary card, here we see that 2 skill point purchase cost again. And on the Explorer, we have a 3 skill point purchase cost. So as an example, if I have these 3 cards, I do have 3 skill points. I could either buy the Mercenary for 2, or I could buy the Explorer card for 3. Now here's what makes the game kind of interesting. If you notice, each of these cards is slightly different. So the Mercenary on the left-hand side has a skill point icon, and it also has 2 swords. I'll talk about swords a little bit later. This is a combat mechanic. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the Explorer, and notice that this one is now going to be worth 2 skill points if you draw it, and then also too, it has a boot icon. The boot icon is for moving, and I'll teach you about that also in the future. So kind of the way to get your deck moving at the beginning of the game, oftentimes players will find themselves going to the Mercenary and the Explorer cards to start priming their deck. Now, why would you want to do that? So as an example, I have these Burgle cards in my deck, and notice that they're only worth 1 skill point. So as I start wanting to make my draw deck more powerful, I want to increase the amount of skill points that I'm obtaining by getting bigger and better cards. So these Burgle cards are great to start, but I would much rather have the Explorer card, because this will allow me to buy more and more expensive cards, which are more and more powerful, and it'll make my draw deck more powerful over the course of the game. Now we're going to put everything together that we've just learned. As I said before, you can play these cards down in any order. So as an example, I would play the Scramble, I'd play Burgle, 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 and then finally Sidestep. Now please notice I have 4 worth of those blue skill icons, which means that I have 4 skill in purchasing power. So I'm going to go ahead and just pop up to the dungeon row. And this is our archaeologist friend, and note that it's worth 2 points. So I'm going to take this card, and then it's going to go into my discard pile. Now, what's interesting is that I still have 2 skill points left, so now I'm going to pop over to our generic cards and take a look at some of the options that I have. We're going to notice that the Mercenary costs 2, and that the Explorer card costs 3. I don't have enough skill points to buy the Explorer card, but I do have enough to buy the Mercenary card. So I'm going to look at that. There's my 2 skill points. I'm going to take this and then stick it into my discard pile. Now that I've done pretty much everything for my turn, and we'll talk about movement and combat a little bit later, but we're just going to assume that I already went ahead and moved my token throughout the dungeon. Now I have the rest of my draw deck. So I'm going to draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards. I'm going to flip these over, and this is going to form my hand for the next turn. Now please notice that I don't have any cards left in my draw deck. Now, and here's a very subtle caveat in this game, you reshuffle your discard pile and it forms your draw deck only when you're forced to draw a card. So at this point, since I had 5 cards, I don't need to draw any more cards until my next turn. So as the next turn comes around, I would spend all 5 of these cards, and then this would go into my discard pile. Now to get set up for the next turn, I would have to draw 5 cards, but there's nothing there. So in this case, I would take my draw deck, I would flip it over, and I would shuffle it together, shuffle it really quickly, and then I would draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards for the next turn. And in this case, this would form the cards for my next turn, and you can see now the Mercenary card is actually in there. So the way that this game works is that you only shuffle your discard pile when you're forced to draw a card. You don't do it simply because it's depleted. Now it's time to learn about basic movement. So here's our opening hand. We already know how to purchase cards using skill points, so I'm going to throw these off to the side. So in our opening hand, we have a Sidestep and a Scramble, and notice that each of these cards has 1 boot icon on it. So I'm going to move these over to this side and show you how that works. So to spend a boot icon, I'm going to act like I'm the green marker in this game. I can move my marker 1 location and then a second location based upon the boot. So I can move 1 location per boot. Now, where things get a little bit complicated is that there are other icons in the dungeon. So in this case, notice that there are 2 boots on this hallway. So if I want to move from this location to this location, I have to spend 2 boots, not just 1, to go down the hallway. So as an example, if I did have these same 2 cards, I could then move only 1 space into the next room. Also, what you will find throughout this maze are crystal caverns. So I went ahead and place the meeple on this room. And you can see that there's multiple ones of these. If I move into a crystal cavern, I can't actually move out of that room again by using boot icons for the remainder of the turn. Basically what they're saying in the game is that the crystal cavern is so complex, it's really hard to escape it, so you get kind of lost in there, and thus navigating is really, really difficult. So as you can see, there's numerous ways that we can move throughout this board. Something else that I want to show you is located over on this side of the board, and notice that there is an arrow. This is a unidirectional hallway, and what that means is that I can't move from here to here, I can only move from here to here. Think of it as a one-way street, and you're not actually allowed to move. Now here's another icon that I want to show you, and it's on the edge of the board. It's on the left-hand side of the board. It has like a hand, and it's pointing to the left. What that means is that if you go down that hallway, it pops you onto the right side of the board right here. So think of it as almost like you're moving off the left to the right and then onto the other side of the board. Next, what we're going to notice is that there's a lock icon on that hallway. What that means is you can't actually go down that hallway unless you have a master key, and I'll show you later kind of what that means. And finally, there is this little dragon head icon, which means that a monster is living in the hallway and you're going to suffer damage if you move down the hallway. As we start learning about combat, I'll teach you what that means and how you can overcome this obstacle. Now that we understand the basics of movement, let's talk about probability. In your initial set of 10 cards, only 2 of them have a boot icon, which means that you're not going to be able to move very far or move very often into the dungeon. So something that you need to focus on when you're playing this game is make sure that you're balancing the amount of skill points that you're getting and combat icons with the amount of boots that you have. So I do want to point to the Explore card right here. It's going to cost you 3 skill points when you're purchasing cards, but what's great about it is that it has a boot icon on it. And just understand that there's a pretty sizable number of these cards, and you can purchase them on almost any turn unless the entire deck becomes depleted. In addition to that, when we start looking at the dungeon row, please notice too that there are other cards located in the dungeon row that assist you in moving as well. Now, one of the most frustrating things I see for new players is that they don't take into account the fact that they need boots to move. And they get really frustrated about turn 3 or 4 in the game when they see their opponents moving deep into the dungeon and they're kind of stuck at the beginning of the game. So just make sure that you're paying attention to boot icons and buy them early so you can continue to move deeper into the dungeon. On the back end of the game, once the game starts to end, it gets very, very dangerous in the dungeon. You need to escape quickly. If you don't have enough boot icons, the chance of you dying increases dramatically. Next, we're going to learn about combat. Your initial set of 10 cards do not have any combat marker icons in them, and notice that these are going to be the sword icons located on the mercenary card. So thus, at the beginning of the game, you are not capable of fighting and killing monsters in the dungeon. So this is something that kind of gets new players a little bit out of alignment too. They don't understand that, hey, without a sword, you can't even fight at all. As an example, the mercenary card is very cheap. It only costs 2 skill points. It gives you 1 skill point and then 2 sword icons when you pull it. Now, what exactly does that mean? And think of it this way. At the bottom of a monster card, so I'm pointing to the bottom of the goblin, please notice that there are 2 sword icons. That's how many swords you need to defeat the goblin. So in this case, the mercenary is able to readily dispatch and kill the goblin. This goblin card is unique, and it sits in the generic set of cards. It can never be removed from the game. It just simply sits here the entire game. So as an example, if you want to start building up a purse of money, the best way to do it is you purchase a mercenary card using your skill points, and then your mercenary card will start cycling through your draw deck. Now, every time you play the mercenary card, you can spend those 2 sword icons to defeat the goblin. When you defeat the goblin, you're going to get 1 gold coin. Now remember, the gold coins can be used to either gain victory points at the end of the game, or you can purchase items from the market, which I'll walk you through a little bit later. Now, not only is the goblin here, but you can defeat it as many times as you want on a turn. So if you have, let's say, 2 mercenaries in your hand, you can play it down to kill the goblin twice on 1 turn, and thus you can get 2 gold coins on 1 turn. Something else that I want to show you is that when we are in the dungeon row, there are monsters actually located in there as well. So in this case, we have the crystal golem, and notice that it has 3 sword icons on the bottom right of the card. That means you have to have at least 3 swords or more to defeat this crystal golem. And also this one says, fight this only in a crystal cave. So we just talked about crystal caves, and we understand what that means. So now when this thing is defeated, you gain 3 skill points for that turn. So that's a great way to readily increase your purchasing power to buy better cards for your deck. But if you don't have the basic amount of swords, you can't even fight. So here's where things get a little bit frustrating for new players. They just don't invest in the mercenary until about halfway through the game. So please note, though, if you get one of these mercenaries quickly, either the first or second turn is what I would recommend, you can start killing goblins intermittently throughout the course of the game and cashing in and buying and getting those gold coins. Let's learn how to fight monsters in hallways now that we understand how to destroy the goblin and the crystal golem. Let's say that we have a mercenary in our hand and our sidestep card. So first what we're going to do is we're going to play the sidestep card to move our green meeple down this hallway. And please notice that there are 2 dragon icons on that tunnel. What that means is that our hero is going to suffer 2 points of damage, and that's simply denoted by this bar located at the bottom of the board. So I'd take 1 or 2 points of damage for going down this hallway because the monster in the hallway is hitting me. Now we can negate that damage by spending sword icons. So as an example, if I have this mercenary card, I can play it and say, you know what, I'm going to spend these 2 icons to nullify the damage I would suffer in the hallway. In that case, I would not suffer that damage. Now here's where the game gets interesting. You might be willing to suffer the damage going down the hallway because you want to spend the swords for something else. Please note, though, if you spend the swords to fight the monster in this tunnel in the hallway, you can't use it to, let's say, fight the goblin later. You're basically spending these sword icons, and you can only spend them once per every time that you play this mercenary card. So be really careful and cautious as you traverse the dungeon. Now let's talk about the hit point tracker. So let's say our valiant hero has suffered 2 points of damage, and you notice that this tracker moves all the way down, and then finally there's a skull icon. If you ever fill up the track and every point of damage you take, you just keep adding another point onto here. If you ever hit the end of the track and you put that last cube on there, you are defeated and you are eliminated from the game. So this is serving as kind of a way to track your hit point total. So something else that I want to talk about really quickly are other things that we can find actually on the map. So let's say our hero is here and we have these 2 cards in our hand. We've got the scramble, and then we also have the sidestep card. So in this case, our hero is saying, hey, you know what? I want to move to this cavern with the heart on it. So we look and we see, hey, the tunnel has 2 boot icons, so thus I have to spend 2 boots to move to this room. I go ahead and do that, and when I hit this heart icon, that heals me 1 point of damage, and I return this to my play area. So notice too that on the map itself, there are rooms with the heart on it, and you can heal and regenerate your character and avoid death. I'm going to close out talking about the generic cards right now, since we've talked about the Goblin, the Mercenary, and the Explorer card. There's also a generic card called the Secret Tome, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on it. And what I want you to notice on this card is that it has a high number of victory points. If you purchase this card, it's going to net you 7 victory points at the end of the game. That's a healthy amount of points, and buying numerous secret tomes over the course of the game is a great strategy to win. Please notice at the bottom, it's going to take 7 skill points to purchase this card, which is a significant amount of skill points. Now, why would you ever buy this thing? And the answer is you get a lot of victory points for it, but please note that it doesn't actually do anything. So when this secret tome is purchased, it starts cycling through your draw deck. So when you get the secret tome on one of your turns, it really doesn't do anything, and it kind of acts as a little bit of a roadblock. So as an example, let's say I'm drawing my cards, and now I draw my 5 cards. Well, the secret tome doesn't actually do anything, so it's kind of wasted. It goes into my discard pile. And please note that at the end of the game is when we count the point total, but until we get to the end of the game, it just kind of is clogging up my deck, and it can be a little bit problematic. So a lot of people, when they see this card, like, ooh, it's 7 victory points, but what they don't realize is that it doesn't do anything. It starts bogging down your deck, and then you have less impactful turns. Next, I'm going to walk you through how Clank actually works in the game from the mechanics of what's in your draw deck. Now, you may remember that when you start Clank, you're going to have a deck of 10 cards, and they're going to be generic. Now, 2 of the cards I haven't talked about are the stumble cards, which are on the screen. When you get the stumble cards, you absolutely have to play them if you draw them into your hand. You don't have a choice. So what you're going to do is place them into your discard pile, and notice that it says +1 Clank. Let's say that we are playing the green player, as we have over the course of the game. All I would do is take a cube and place it into the Clank area. Now, you may have noticed that there's already some cubes in the starting area at the beginning of the game. So the first player is going to put 3 cubes into the Clank area. The second player that goes is going to place 2, and then finally the third player is going to place 1. The fourth player is going to place 0 into the Clank area. Now, what you want to do is minimize the amount of Clank, and it's based upon probability. So when a dragon attacks, what you're going to do is take all of the Clank from the Clank area, and then you're going to go ahead and place it into your draw bag. And then consequently, you're going to draw the number of cubes from the bag that corresponds to the dragon tracker. Once you do that, if any of the colored cubes, such as one of the ones that I have in my hand, appears, that's going to be translated to damage on your character in the damage area of the board. I'm going to teach you now about dragon attacks. So let's say we're playing the game of Clank, and as part of this tutorial, we've learned about the archaeologist, and let's just assume that we've taken the archaeologist and placed it into our discard pile. As a result of that, once I've purchased all of my cards on my turn, using all of the skill points that I have, I'm going to go to the draw deck, and then I'm going to reveal a new card and place it into the dungeon row. Please notice that there is a dragon icon on this emerald card. What that means is that the dragon is going to attack. So how do you actually perform the attack? We're going to snap up to our Clank area, and all you have to do is grab all of the cubes from the Clank area. We're going to take them and we're going to drop them into our draw bag. We're going to go ahead and mix that up, and then we're going to draw the corresponding number of dragon cubes based upon the location of the dragon marker. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and move the dragon out of the way. We have 2 markers on this portion of the board. So what that means is that I'm going to go into the draw bag and draw 2 cubes. When I reveal those cubes, notice that one of them is black, which just simply means I'm going to remove it from the game. But this one right here, this sort of bluish green color, this is going to translate to damage on a player's damage tracker. So I'm going to take this cube and I'm going to place it right here, which means that this character has suffered 1 wound. If this character suffers all of these wounds on the track, and the final portion of this track, which is the skull, is covered up, that means that the player is eliminated. So let's go ahead and just talk about the probability really quickly. This dragon bag right here is going to start with 24 black dragon cubes. So over the course of the game, what's going to happen is that as you draw more and more cubes out of the bag, so let's say I'm going to draw another 2. So in this case, they're both black. I'm going to remove them from the game permanently. Now, what that means is that the probability of the dragon not hitting somebody is decreasing over the course of the game. And consequently, as I start adding more and more cubes from different players into that draw bag, it's going to be more likely that you're going to suffer damage if that dragon attacks. So please note too that the dragon will only attack once per turn. So let's say in the dungeon row, we draw a second dungeon card. Well, we're not actually going to have to worry about that because the dragon can only attack once per each of your turns. So hopefully you can see over the course of the game, the dragon is going to become more and more aggressive. And why is that? Well, I'm going to pop out and look at this tracker. So as the dragon gets more and more aggressive, you notice that it can go up to 5 cubes total. In addition to that, in the dungeon row, we also have cards such as this dragon shrine. And please notice that there's a plus symbol on here and a danger sort of note on here. It says pull +1 cube for dragon attacks. So in this case, if we have the +1 dragon attack right here and the marker is at 5, it's going to cause you to draw 6 different player cubes from this bag, which is going to make it more and more likely that the players are being damaged. Let's have a quick conversation about the dragon tracker in the game. It's going to start in one of these positions based upon if the 2, 3, or 4 people are playing the game. Now, this dragon tracker will increase, and thus the dragon will become more aggressive when a couple different things happen. One, if one of these egg tokens is pulled, which is one of the small question mark icons, the player will take it, but it angers the dragon. You're basically stealing one of its dragon eggs. If a player picks up a dragon egg token, it advances the dragon marker 1 position. Secondarily, the dragon really likes its artifacts in the dungeon. So anytime a player removes an artifact token from the board and takes it from the board, it also increases the dragon tracker by 1 position. Now, I'll go ahead and show you this. It'll curve around and ultimately get to 5 cubes on the top of the dragon tracker, which means it's in its most dangerous form. Please also notice too that in your dragon row, and I mentioned this before, you're going to have cards that add 1 to the dragon attack. And then also at the top of the board, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, one of the end conditions is that after somebody is eliminated from the game or they have removed one of the artifacts from the dungeon and made it back to the start, it's going to start this sort of tracker until the game ends. And what's going to happen there is it's also going to ramp up the dragon attack. So you're going to have all these bonuses on the dragon, and it's going to be drawing more cubes. So as the game progresses, the dragon is more and more aggressive, and the likelihood of death increases significantly. Now that we have a basic understanding of the game mechanics, we're going to continue on and start talking about the different tokens and things that you can actually find on the board. We have 2 different things. We have these small circular tokens with a question mark, which are known as minor secrets. They're going to be smaller in diameter. And then we also have what's called a major secret, which is the larger token. So anytime you take your playing piece and you move it into a room, you can recover 1 item from that room, and all you have to do is simply flip it face up, and then you take it and put it into your inventory location. Now, where this gets a little bit crazy is that, let's say you do, instead of moving from this crystal cavern into here, you move and then you take this artifact. Please remember that this will trigger the dragon to advance the tracker 1 location. So as you can see all over this board, there's a whole host of different tokens and icons that you can pick up over the course of the game. So what I would recommend is if you have a choice to move into a room with or without a token, always focus on moving into the room with a token because you're going to get something out of it. On the back of the rule book is a guide for both the major secrets, the minor secrets, and then the market items. I'll go into how to use the market in just a second. So please note there's a pretty good description of what everything does on the back of the rule book. And also note too, a lot of this stuff is very intuitive, so the same symbols and icons are used throughout the game. As an example, if you have a healing potion, has a little heart on it. We already talked about the heart rooms previously. This potion of movement, it's called a potion of swiftness, has a little boot icon on it. So when you drink this potion, it gives you 1 movement. And then also too, we have a potion of strength that has 2 swords on it. Well, when you drink this potion, you get 2 swords for an attack. Please note too that these are just one-time use items. The dragon egg, you go ahead and just keep it until the end of the game, and then you score 3 points at the very end of the game. Next, what we're going to do is talk about the different market items. Let's go ahead and have a quick conversation about the marketplace. Located roughly in the center of the board, there are 4 locations that say market on them. And then if you look, there are 7 gold in the center of the board, and there's little arrows pointing to all of the different marketplace spaces on the board. So kind of what that means is that if your play piece is in any of these market spaces, so as an example, let's say your play piece is in this location right here, you can take 7 gold and then you can spend that 7 gold to buy any one of these items up here in the player area. And there's 3 different types in the base game. And the first one is going to be the crown. And it's going to start with 10 points, 9 points, and it drops down to 8 points. And this is just simply victory points. Please note too that some of the cards in the game also reference having a crown, so it might unlock special effects for you. Next up, we have a backpack. Now, when you're playing Clank, kind of the basic rule is that you're not allowed to have more than one of the artifact tokens in the game, but the backpack kind of breaks that rule. So if you purchase a backpack, and please note you're going to have to spend 7 gold for it, it's going to give you 5 victory points at the end of the game, but then you can carry an additional artifact. So as an example, maybe you've picked up this 5-point artifact, and then later on you're lucky enough to get the 30-point artifact. Then you could score those both at the end of the game, so it gives you a big advantage. Next up, we have the Master Key. The Master Key allows you to go through locked locations. So as an example, I'm going to point to this lock here on the game board. So if you have purchased a Master Key, it allows you to move through these locked hallways, which is a pretty fantastic ability. So let's kind of talk about the payoff and gold. So I mentioned before that gold is sort of dual purpose. At the end of the game, you're going to score 1 victory point for each gold piece that you have. But please note too that when you're spending gold, it's almost like you're spending victory points. So just ensure that you're getting something out of it in return. So as an example, if I'm going to spend 7 gold to buy a 10-point crown, player token, this token right here, I'm only going to net 3 victory points because I have to spend 7 gold, which is 7 victory points to buy this. So please note too, when you buy the backpack, you're actually kind of going in the hole a little bit because it's going to cost you 7 gold to buy a 5 victory point item, but it does allow you to get a second artifact. Now you still have to get the artifact and you still have to survive and get out, so that's a little bit of risk associated with it. And then there's the Master Key, so you're going to lose a couple victory points, but the Master Key is going to allow you to traverse the dungeon and get into areas where you can get more loot and it's more readily accessible. Here's a few additional rules that I didn't have a chance to talk about previously, but to kind of close out a lot of the rules, I'm going to talk about it right now. So we're going to go back to our dungeon row and have a quick conversation about some of the things that you can actually see in the dungeon row. So one thing I did want to point out, there are cards with a purple border at the top. They're fairly similar in color to the items that you can purchase in the game. And this kind of gets players out of alignment. And I see this literally every game about 4 or 5 times. Devices are one-use items. So when you pay to use this dragon shrine, so you're going to pay 4 skill points to use it. This does not go into your draw deck. This goes into the discard pile. So you would go ahead and take it and remove it from the dungeon row. It would trigger its effect at the bottom, and then it's simply removed from the play area. Next up, we're going to talk about other cards that you can draw. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this card. And please note at the bottom of it, there's a new sort of keyword that we haven't talked about. It's called acquire. And what that means is that when you purchase this card, so if I spend the 5 skill points to purchase this card and then it goes into my discard pile for my draw deck, it's going to give me 2 Clank. So we talked about Clank before, and obviously this is not the best sort of thing to be happening to you. But just notice that there are acquire conditions and effects that trigger when you do purchase those cards. Next up, we're going to talk about arrival effects. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this over to the side. And notice on the right-hand side of the card where my thumb is, there's an exclamation point. And what that means is that when this thing arrives into the dungeon row, it's going to trigger this arrival effect. So this one says all players get +1 Clank. So when this thing pops into the dungeon row, every single player in the game is going to get a Clank. So kind of what makes this game fun is that as people start purchasing cards from the dungeon row, different effects and different things can be triggering over the course of the game. And finally, the one thing I did want to mention too is like always be aware of the dragon icon. When this thing pops, the dragon will attack, but it will only trigger once per player's turn. Let's say you draw multiple dragon icons into the dungeon row on the same turn, the dragon will only attack one time. All right, so now we have some special rules that trigger when either the first player is eliminated or the first player leaves the dungeon and has gained their mastery token. So there's a tracker up on top. You're going to place the first meeple that meets one of those conditions in that location. Now, once you have left the dungeon and you were up on top, you can no longer be eliminated from the game. As an example, if you're drawing attack cubes from the dragon bag and you've already left the dungeon, so let's say you're the green player, those cubes don't do anything. You can't be eliminated once you've escaped the dungeon. You just go ahead and simply put those cubes back into your supply. So that's kind of great news, and that's why you want to leave the dungeon as soon as possible. You can't be killed once you do leave the dungeon. Now, on your turn, you're not going to be taking a normal turn. All you have to do is take your pawn, your meeple here, and you move it to the next location. And if you notice underneath, there's a plus symbol that appears there. That's going to amplify any dragon attack by +1 cube that you're going to pull from the bag. And then at the end of your turn, it's going to trigger a dragon attack. Okay, so the dragon attack, you know that it's there, and it's very faint on the board. I'll try to zoom in, but you can see this dragon icon. So it's in this position, the third position, and then the final position is a skull, which just simply means anybody left in the dungeon is killed. Okay, because the dragon becomes super aggressive, it just eliminates everybody. So once the green player starts down this track, the first turn, the dragon's going to attack with +1 cubes, then it's +2 cubes, then +3 cubes, and then finally it kills everybody. So once a player leaves the dungeon, the game has a finite number of turns left, and if you don't get out in time, this meeple will hit here and you're automatically eliminated from the game. So this is where kind of the cool speed and risk element comes into play. If you're willing to risk staying in the catacombs of the dungeon just a little bit longer, you can get more victory points, but then you run the risk, especially if somebody's made it out of the dungeon, of the timer essentially running out, and then you're eliminated from the game. Alrighty, so now we're going to go through the final scoring for the game. So let's say the game is ended and our green meeple has made it all the way across the board. What that means is that any player still left in the catacomb is eliminated. So in this example, we're going to say that we have both the yellow and the red player. So I'm going to look at the green player's score first because that person exited the dungeon and they're going to gain the most benefit because they survived the entire experience. I'm going to go ahead and pop down here, and I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the cards that the green player had. So, in a full game, you're obviously going to have a lot more stuff, but this is just an illustration. So the green player grabbed an artifact. They also made it out of the catacomb without dying with the artifact, so they get the 20-point mastery. And then they also found a dragon egg along the way. In addition to that, they have 3 cards in the upper right-hand corner has all of the points associated with that. So the green player would just simply add up all of these points, and if that point total is higher than the other ones, they would win the game. Next up, we have the yellow player, and the yellow player was struggling a little bit, didn't have a chance to pick up an artifact, but ended up with this emerald. So when the game ended, the yellow player had not quite made it out of the dungeon. They were in here, but please notice it's above this green line. And what that means is that if a player is eliminated like above this green line, they're not considered in the depths. What that means is that the villagers will pull them out of the dungeon. And so the person is going to just simply score whatever points they had, in their play area. They don't get the mastery token, the 20 points. And then finally, we have our red player. So our red player was really going for it, went down into this really nasty area and got some pretty decent loot. So we're going to go ahead and look at that player's loot. Now notice they did get the 30-point artifact token. They also got one of these monkey totems, and they had the master key. So you would add all these points together, but since the red player was below the green line, which you can see on the map, when the player was eliminated, they score 0 points. So everything is removed from their play area, and they don't get any points. So they're just completely out of the running. So when you're playing the game of Clank, please be sure to not die beneath this green line, which is known as the depths. If you do that, you're going to score 0 points, and you have absolutely zero chance of winning the game. So the remainder of this video I'm going to dedicate to some basic strategies. So if you're new to the game, you can start using these right out of the gate in your first game, and it will make you a lot more competitive. So the first one I'm going to talk about is kind of the concept of combat. And a lot of players, especially new ones, really don't get into combat in their first several games, and they just kind of stay away from that mechanic altogether. So what I'm going to recommend for new players is to get a mercenary card fairly early in the game. And what that's going to allow you to do is to start killing the goblin. So notice that the mercenary card has 1 skill point, which is fantastic, but it also has 2 swords. And the goblin, which is a card that stays in play the entire game, and it can be defeated an unlimited number of times. So once you start cycling these mercenary cards through your deck, you'll be able to defeat the goblin, and then you're going to start obtaining gold. So gold is extremely important. It gives you a victory point. So no matter what your strategy is, just having free victory points at the end of the game is always good. In addition to that, gold can be used to purchase different items from the marketplace as well. So one of the basic strategies is a combat sort of strategy. So if you start embracing combat early on in your understanding of the Clank game, you're going to get more out of that game. So as an example, if you get a few mercenary cards early on, these are going to start cycling through your deck, and you're going to start building up a decent amount of gold. Now, as you start sort of entering the labyrinth and your token starts progressing down deeper and deeper into this dungeon, you're going to also be picking up gold in various places. In addition to that, in the dungeon row, enemies are fairly common, and I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in on the top of the dungeon row because we have 2 of them in place. So as an example, if you defeat the Watcher, you're going to get 3 gold, and all other players get 1 Clank. So that's fantastic. You're gaining gold, and you're also harming your opponents at the same time. So please note that just buying a few mercenaries at the beginning of the game allows you to start destroying and killing these monsters. In addition to that, if you want more advanced strategies, which use things like the master key and the backpack, you're going to need the 7 gold to buy one of these items. And there's a real benefit for you being able to go into hidden areas with this master key, and also more importantly, getting 2 artifacts from the dungeon. So your point totals are going to increase significantly if you start integrating combat into your basic set of strategies. So next I'm going to have a pretty quick conversation about the left-hand side of the board. If you're a new player, there's an interesting area, and we kind of call it the monkey loop, or at least our game group does. So on the left-hand side, there is this monkey temple, and there's 3 of these monkey tokens that you can pick up. Now, each time your character moves into the area, you can only pick up 1 of the tokens, and you can't pick up a new one until you go into the area again, so you can't just sit there and take tokens over and over again. It only triggers when you move into the room. But what you can see is that there's a lot of like one-way tunnels in this portion of the board. In addition to that, you have a 15-point artifact on the right-hand side of it. So this one's really easy to pick up. So If you want to get 30 points pretty quick, come on to the left-hand side of the board. In addition to that, I see a lot of players do sort of a hybrid strategy. They're going to move into the marketplace, and what they're going to do is grab this 20-point artifact, and then they head over to the left and then start doing this loop on the other side. If you can get all of those points together, that's going to net you 35 points, which is a pretty good combo. So if you're new to the game, head on to the left-hand side of the board and go ahead and walk through the monkey loop. Next up, I'm going to have a quick discussion about getting high victory point cards for your draw deck itself. There seems to be a pretty big disconnect between new players and the concept of getting gems as related to secret tomes. So on the right-hand side of the screen is a secret tome, and there are a pile of these sitting on the game table when you start the game. Now, please notice that it's going to cost you 7 skill points to purchase this card, and then at the end of the game, it's going to net you 7 victory points. But the one thing about this is that the text box on this card is completely blank. So if this thing is then starting to cycle through your deck, when you draw it, it doesn't actually do anything for you. So that kind of dilutes the potency of your deck, not from the perspective of victory points, but from the perspective of mid-game when you're trying to use your deck to do things. So on the left-hand side of the screen, I just went ahead and put an emerald down, and there are many gems in the game. Now, a lot of players really don't like, especially new ones, they don't like the fact that it has an acquisition sort of thing. So at the bottom it says acquire, you get 2 Clank. So that means that you're going to have to put 2 Clank cubes in, which could eventually translate to damage. So new players really shy away from the gems, I've noticed. And I want to try to break that tendency for you if you're a new player right now. Now, this thing is 5 skill points, and it nets you 5 victory points at the end of the game. It's not as good as the 7, but where these cards shine is that you get to draw a card. So if I'm drawing the secret tome, I just have to put it in my discard pile and get nothing out of it. If the gem comes up, it allows me to draw a card. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just throwing this into my discard pile and I'm able to draw something else. So that gives me a very playable turn. In addition to that, there are some cards that trigger off of gems in particular, so they can give you some bonuses in relation to that. So in general, what I'm going to recommend new players do is that if you want to invest in gems, do that as part of the early and the mid game. And if you're on your way out of the catacomb, it's okay to start diluting your deck a little bit because you're headed to the surface. So if you buy a couple of the secret tomes, I would wait till the late game and kind of wait till you're traversing and leaving the actual catacomb itself before you start buying these. It will keep your deck strong throughout the greatest portion of the game. A lot of deck building games have a trash mechanic, and what that means is that you can remove cards basically from your draw deck so that you don't have to see them in the future. And think of it as a way to prune your draw deck and remove stuff that's a little bit weaker. So as the game progresses, you are buying really powerful cards, but you still have those original 10 cards from your sort of opening deck that will kind of like bog you down, or they can weigh you down. So I'm going to walk you through the trash mechanic. So in this game, they have several different trash sorts of options. This one is a token that you pull, and it's going to be one of the minor secrets with a question mark on it. So when you pull this, it basically says that at the end of the turn, trash a card from your discard pile or your play area and return the card and this token to the box. So, you know, let's say you're the adventurer, you get this token, and then at the end of the turn, you're saying, hey, I'm going to look through my discard pile and get rid of a card permanently from my draw deck. Well, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so you can see what's going on. Now, notice that I have a stumble card, and the stumble card doesn't do anything for you. It just brings you down. It gives you Clank, and obviously you don't want Clank in this game. So at the end of my turn, I look at my discard pile, I'm like, that's a great option to remove. I would take this card and remove it, and it goes back to the box. And so what I effectively just did is that I removed the stumble card from my draw deck. So when I draw a stumble, it doesn't give me any sort of benefit. I can't move, I don't get skill points for it, and it harms me with the Clank. So now this is no longer in the deck for me to draw. So not only is that card missing, but I'm also not getting the negative Clank. So something else I see new players struggle with is when they get one of these trash icons, they won't get rid of their burgle cards for whatever reason. I always tell them, hey, those are weak, but they always say, well, yeah, but I get a skill point from it. Yeah, but over the course of the game, you're going to start buying things like Explore. So if you have the option to pull an Explore card or a burgle card from your draw deck, you obviously want the Explore card because it's simply more powerful. So this is a word of wisdom to new players. If you do have a burgle card in your discard pile and you do pull one of these tokens and you want to get rid of it, it's totally fine. Now, obviously, get rid of the stumble first, but don't be hesitant to get rid of one of these basic cards or even the sidestep one. If you have much better movement cards in your deck, feel free to start even getting rid of those cards. The less cards you have in your deck, the more likely it is that you're going to draw the cards that you really, really want. Next up, I'm going to give you a general play tip, and that's going to be notice where every person is moving on their turn. If you don't want to necessarily pay attention to exactly what they're doing each turn, that's one thing, but definitely be cognizant of where they're moving to. And if it appears that they're starting to move out of the catacomb, be very cognizant of that. If they reach the surface first, it will trigger that timer at the top of the screen up here that we talked about previously, and that could lead to death for you very, very easily because you have a limited number of turns in which you can escape the catacomb without dying. So one of the strategies in this game is to get in and get out quickly, and you get in and get out so quickly that the other opponents get trapped in the catacomb and they get eliminated by the dragon attacks. And they thus get 0 points. So that if they're in the depths, which is below this green line, if they don't get out, they literally get 0 points. So even if you've only scored just maybe 20 points over the course of the game, that 20 is much better than that 0, and then they also get eliminated from the game. So anytime you start seeing somebody trying to leave the catacomb, or you think that they're leaving the catacomb, just ask them, say, hey, are you headed on the way out? Are you leaving? And they don't have to answer you, but a lot of times they will, and they'll be like, yeah, I'm getting out of here. If they tell you that they're starting to leave, then you need to start kind of focusing on moving your way out because it's very easy to get trapped, especially if you get a couple bad card draws and you don't get a lot of movement icons. You can get trapped down here and eliminated from the game. One of my final tips on this game is to do a basic form of card counting when you're putting your deck together. When you start the game, you're going to have 10 cards in your original draw deck. And if you notice, there's only going to be 2 of those 10 that actually have boot icons on them. So if you just kind of think of it as, okay, I've got 2 boot cards out of 10, that really means that I only have 1 in 5 cards are going to actually allow me to move. And one of the points of this game is that if you do not have enough boot icons, you can't get into the catacomb to get the treasure, nor can you get out in time. So one of the things I want to kind of walk you through is kind of the concept of really having 2 or 3 boots in your draw deck per each turn that you play. And what that means is that you can move anywhere from 2 to 3 spaces. That's what you want to be targeting. So as an example, I put a bunch of different cards up here on the screen that we can take a look at. And they're all pretty interesting, and a lot of them are fairly basic. So on the top row, we have just some basic movement cards. We also have Sneak, which gives you -2 Clank. It allows you to move, and it decreases your Clank. That's fantastic. Please note, too, that you can find other ways to move. So as an example, the animated door, if you defeat this thing, and it's only 1 sword icon to do it, you can take an extra move. Next up, we have the Wand of Recall. If you have an artifact, teleport to the adjacent room. So this is a movement style card as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a boot icon, but what it means is that you can move. We also have companions in the game. So like this one is going to add a sword, and it's going to add a boot icon as well. We also have another companion over here with 2 boots, and then it has a special ability on the bottom. And then finally, we have the generic Explore cards, and then also 2. Make sure you understand that the minor secrets, there are a bunch of these movement potions. You can go ahead and spend this potion to give you 1 boot. So don't rule any of those things out when you are playing this game. So movement is the key to survival. And so try to really target having 2 to 3 movement per turn. Now, why don't you want any more than that? I'm going to kind of zoom out, and I want you to look at the crystal caverns that are located all over the place. In addition to that, there's a bunch of these tunnels where you need 2 boot icons to move. So as an example, if I move my play piece into a crystal cavern, I don't actually get to move out of that crystal cavern. It prevents me from moving again that turn. So if I have additional boots, it really doesn't matter. In addition to that, if I don't have at least 2 boot icons, I can't even move down this tunnel. So imagine if you get kind of trapped in this crystal cavern and you want to move into this artifact room, you have to wait until you get 2 boots. Well, if you don't have enough boots flowing and circulating through your draw deck, it's going to make it impossible to move through some of these tunnels. So there's kind of a sweet spot. You don't want so many movement cards that they're wasted because you end up in a crystal cavern, but you also want to have enough so that you can traverse these tunnels with these 2 boot icons on them. So really the sweet spot is to try to target drawing anywhere from 2 to 3 boot icons per each time you actually draw cards into your hand. So when you start the game, start counting in your head roughly how many movement cards have been placed into your deck, and then also to understand how many overall cards that you have. And that's just like a general overall guideline for how you can be successful and move effectively in the game of Clank. To kind of sum it up, I want to talk about the overall game of Clank. I think it's a really fun game. What's great about this game is that it is excellent for introductory players to board gaming in general, but especially deck building games. This is one of the easier deck building games in my opinion, and it's also a lot of fun. So you get to build a deck of cards. Not only that though, but you get to explore this dungeon while you're doing it. So the complexity level I think is very low. The playtime is very, very moderate. I think in general we were averaging about 35 to maybe 45 minutes for a 4-player game and about 50 minutes for a 5-player game. So the base game you can purchase and up to 4 players can play it. There is an expansion for it. It's called the Adventuring Party, which boosts this up to 5 or 6 players. So I think that's a great option if you have a slightly larger gaming group. The lack of complexity makes this great for game nights in which people are very, very social. So you don't have to be completely just like tuned into the game because it is so easy to play. So if you are looking for a game night that's a little bit more social, this is definitely the game for you. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today for this Clank video. And as always, have fun gaming.